Hello and welcome, valued guests and panel member judges. My name is Sarah, and I'm joined here up here today with my team members Gaurav, Nicholas, Tanzil, and David. And we're very excited to present our findings on Indigenous identity and economic disparity in Canada. We would like to first acknowledge that we are gathered here today on the traditional lands of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. So we were specifically tasked with investigating whether there was significant income differences between people of indigenous identity and non-Indigenous identity in Canada. And our regressions produced some interesting findings. We were specifically interested in looking at changes in age. So we found that for non-Indigenous youth and Indigenous youth, there was a marked difference. Specifically, there was a $26 wage gap per week on average. However, Indigenous youth are working about 2 hours more. When we look at adults, you find that it actually flips, and that non-Indigenous adults are making on average about $66 more per week than their Indigenous counterparts while they're working fewer hours. This supports the literature's hypothesis that there exists a sticky floor wherein certain populations are inhibited from achieving higher earning potential. And also we can see from the graph that these changes are systemic and they are occurring over a longer time period. I'm just gonna pass it off to Gaurav, who's gonna speak more to employment differences.
Thank you, Sarah. Even though the weekly wages are higher for Indigenous youth, but it is true for a smaller section only. This can be observed from the employment rate discrepancy between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, with an 8% less employment rate for Indigenous youth and 12% less employment rate for Indigenous adults in comparison to non-Indigenous people. Now, Nick will speak more about our main findings.
Thank you. Our data provided us with 3 key findings. The first was that Aboriginal individuals are all disproportionately affected by the economic cycles over time. For example, in our data, the 2009 financial crisis and the 2015 oil crisis disproportionately negatively affected Aboriginal individuals compared to their non-Aboriginal counterparts. The second is that Indigenous people between the ages of 25 and 54 consistently make 93 cents on the dollar compared to their non-Indigenous counterparts. This might not seem like such a big issue, however, we must remember that it is systematic. As we've seen in the graph earlier, those 2 lines never touch one another. And finally, Indigenous individuals between the ages of 15 to 24, the youth group, while they may have lower employment rates, when they are able to secure employment, they consistently work higher numbers of hours for a higher hourly wage than their non-Aboriginal counterparts.
So as Nick pointed out, that there is a Indigenous populations are more susceptible to the economic cycles of Canada. So as you can tell that the GDP, if it drops by 10% in Canada, they will lose 12% of their average weekly pays. This might not seem like a lot, but it's $244 on average for the Indigenous youth populations, which is more than a monthly budget for groceries for the average Canadian households. And this is an already underpaid population, so it's a very significant hit for them. And their non-Indigenous youth in Canada is not as affected by these numbers. And also, as Nick pointed out earlier, in times of recessions, you can tell by looking at the employment rate, the blue lines are Indigenous people. So in times of recession, they lose employment a lot faster than the non-Indigenous populations. And so they're a lot more vulnerable to the GDP cycles. So we wanted to understand why this was happening, and our literature review and Statistics Canada both point to the fact that certain industries are just more susceptible to the business cycles, and Indigenous populations are more represented in these industries, 3 of which we have put up here for you to look at, and you can tell that Indigenous people are more represented in these industries. Not only that, the interesting part is that they're represented at the most bottom levels, so they're the lower paying jobs. The minute the economy goes on a down, they have layoffs, and the first people to be laid off are Indigenous people. So we wanted to find ways to create policies that would help put them into sectors that are more sustainable on a long run, and David will take you through some of these policies.
Thanks. So obviously, Indigenous income disparity is a massive and systemic issue that we're not going to be able to solve in a 5-minute policy pitch. So there's lots of economic incentives and programs that the federal government's using right now, but we wanted to focus specifically on some policy options that would help diversify the labor market and to also build self-sustainability. So our first option for a sort of immediate and short-term effect, we wanted to recommend changes in regulations to grant exclusive rights to the sale of hunted game and fish to Indigenous communities. We think that this is a potentially huge market, and this would be an opportunity for Indigenous communities to capitalize on their natural and renewable resources without sacrificing their land rights. This market could be self-regulated by the Indigenous community, and we think that it would foster a lot of entrepreneurship in small, remote communities where there might not be much industry otherwise. Secondly, our long-term policy is a bit more broad in general, but we want to encourage and foster trust and collaboration between Indigenous governments and federal governments to try to find ways of, in partnership with things like the Indigenous Skills and Employment Strategy, to foster a diversification in industry, especially with things like the digital sectors. So as we reach broadband parity across the country, things like data analysis and programming no longer becomes region-based. It can be basically done from anywhere. And so first, particularly in remote and northern communities, this could be a potential boon for economy. And finally, we just want to point out that this isn't just a matter of, from a social and sort of humanitarian perspective, but by closing the gap in the Indigenous income, there could be a potential increase of upwards of $28 billion to the Canadian economy. So it's important for every Canadian to consider these options. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening.
Great. John?
Thank you. That's a great piece of work. I'm somewhat familiar with those stats, so well done. I think you nailed it. Just on the policy side, maybe kind of an open question. You talk about some ideas there, but what do you? Because one of the things you notice is the consistent and systemic underemployment of Aboriginal Canadians in all those industries. What do you think is the role of industry to change that trend? Aside, obviously, you identify some government role, but what's the role of industry to do something about that?
Thank you. Who wants to take it? Sarah or David?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic question. And obviously, like, the government has fewer levers to affect the industry side of things directly. One of the other issues that we looked at but omitted here directly was education and skills training. Which is another major factor for, again, leaving that sticky floor and climbing the ladder. Education in and of itself is another huge systemic and monolithic issue where we actually are seeing that things like increases in college and trades training is having a quantifiable and noticeable increase in the likelihood of employment in the Indigenous population, which is fantastic. We've been seeing increases in university graduation rates. The problem with that whole post-secondary sector is that it's great that post-secondary education is improving their likelihood of employment, but to get a post-secondary education, you need a secondary education. And across all of this, the Indigenous high school graduation rate remains staggeringly low. And that in and of itself is just an entirely other policy issue that we didn't really want to try to address in, again, like say a 5-minute policy pitch here. So. Yep.
Sorry about that. I'll go to next time. Susan and then Dan.
Thank you. Really great presentation. Just the same question. Did you see the pattern that you showed across Canada? Did you see any significant variations across different regions, provinces, or any one province or region doing something more impactful?
So we did run a provincial control for this. We did not have territory data because of missing data on Aboriginal people, which is something we'd like to actually point out that we do need more data collection on them to begin with. The Atlantic provinces were also grouped together because of lack of significant data on them. And Saskatchewan seemed to be an anomaly, but that could be due to other reasons that we would like to further explore. And I think David actually did an additional paper on this too, which provided to some of the findings of it. If you would like.
Yeah, well, and the reason that we looked generally at the Canadian averages rather than provincially, part of it was that our data was from 2007 to 2019, which obviously falls directly over the economic downturns in 2009 and 2015. And the individual provincial response absorbed that impact very differently. And so there was a lot of fluctuation, and again, especially in places like Saskatchewan that had smaller populations and a higher representation in Indigenous population. So we just wanted, there was a ton of variation and it just looked ugly and it just kind of complicated everything. So by looking at national averages across the whole country, just sort of evened everything out a little bit better.
I think you already touched on it, but did you think of doing control for education, or what level of education was reached? And I'm thinking in particular of your outcome where the youth, Indigenous youth, were earning more, less employed, but earning more than non-Indigenous. And I'm trying to think, without being biased, but I think we've done some work that shows that, of course, staying in school versus not staying in school is a major determinant of outcomes. Have you thought of controlling for that?
Yeah, so we did look into that, and like I said, with as I was saying with the high school graduation rates, we just found that it creates a kind of a gate, and it's similar to what we saw in the youth employment rates, where those who were working were actually doing quite well and working lots and earning lots. And we've seen the same thing with education, where those who do pursue post-secondary education perform quite well and reap those benefits. But there is still this massive gate of high school graduation, and as we saw, the youth employment rate is that much lower too. So there is sort of a filter effect, I suppose, of that barrier to entry. So it is a huge factor. It's just that for the purposes of this analysis, we just thought that it added too many other complicating factors to kind of look at it directly.